the Sony PlayStation. Few names in the industry have the impact of PlayStation. This entertainment titan dominated 90s gaming culture, helping to usher in a new world of incredible 3D experiences like none other before it. It's hard to believe in a world without PlayStation. Whether or not you're a fan of the console or the brand, it's hard to deny the impact that it has had on our lives as gamers. This industry would look entirely different without the likes of the mighty PlayStation. It's a console that completely changed the landscape of the modern gaming industry as it succeeded massively and continued on to spawn successors that would bring great experiences to gamers for years to come. With its revolutionary 3D capabilities, its incredible games, and its ability to not fail like some consoles before it, it managed to secure its place in pop culture as the gaming juggernaut of the 1990s that we know so well today. The console was released in Japan on the 3rd of December 1994, in North America on the 9th of September 1995, in Europe on the 29th of September 1995, and let's get a drum roll for Australia, who was screwed like usual and got it later than everybody else. Complete bullshit. On the 15th of November 1995. Sorry, Australia. The hardware inside consisted of a MIPS R3000 CPU running at 33.9 MHz, pushing 30 million instructions per second. Some graphics hardware was also contained within the CPU, sort of making it an SoC, or System on Chip. SoCs are the same processors powering modern smart devices like smartphones. Now, while this wasn't a true SoC, since not every component of the system was integrated into it, it did have some of the makings, so that's what I'm going to call it. Within this SoC was a coprocessor that handled vector math instructions to allow the console to push better lighting, geometry, and polygon and coordinate transformations. In English, that simply means that it could help the main GPU create, for the time, very smoothly running and well-detailed 3D figures and environments in real time. Also within the SoC was a motion decoder, much like the one you had to add to the back of your Sega Saturn if you had one of those back then. What the motion decoder did was allow the console to play back full motion video, or FMV, right out of the box without the need for an external or add-on decoder. The dedicated graphics chip was a proprietary Sony GPU, which, at least on the chip itself, is named CXD8606AQ, or at least it is on the SCPH5001 motherboard that I have on my console, but we'll be sure to get onto the console revisions in a little bit. This GPU had 1 entire megabyte of dedicated VRAM and a 2 kilobyte texture cache to boost performance a little bit. It had a maximum resolution output of 640 by 480, which, of course, was the standard resolution for televisions at the time, and it was capable of displaying precisely 16,777,216 colors, or 24-bit color as we know it these days. Inside the GPU was also a sprite engine that could handle rotation, scaling, warping, transparency, fading, and vertical and horizontal line scrolling. Moving on to sound hardware, this thing had to push CD audio, of course, and it had just the right sound processing unit for the job. This too was a Sony proprietary part, and rightfully so. Sony, even to this day, is well known for some of the best sound gear on the market. It had a sampling rate of up to 44.1 kHz and supported MIDI sequencing, pitch modulation, envelope, looping, and it was capable of producing its own reverb. This was pretty standard stuff for Sony. And again, in English, an envelope is a tool used for modulation, or basically turning a theoretical knob to change an aspect of any certain sound. And now on to the feature presentation, the CD-ROM drive. This was the big defining feature of the PlayStation. So much controversy and technological advancement is centered around the CD tech that went into this console, and I'll be more than sure to get into the juicy details a little later. This CD-ROM drive was, well, a CD-ROM drive. It allowed the console to play games with much larger file sizes than the cartridge-based consoles before it, like Nintendo's NES and SNES, and therefore could provide far better visuals, sounds, and controls. This was a pivotal moment in gaming history that would push other industry players to widely adopt the format. Now, of course, other console manufacturers had tried working with CDs before, but they had all mostly failed. Sony was able to take this new tech and put it into something that took the world by storm, further cementing the CD and eventually DVD's dominance in the years following the release of Sony's next console, the PS2. But that's not really what we're talking about in this video. Don't worry though, a PS2 video will happen. There were some issues with the CD drives on the older PS1s though. Many users had to resort to turning their consoles upside down in order to get the lasers to read discs properly, since the drives would often fail, resulting in an inability to play games. And finishing off the main components, the console housed a whole 2 megabytes of EDO DRAM. As the 5th generation went on, Sony released a few different iterations of the PS1 hardware. The first model, called the SCPH-1000, had direct composite outputs, a parallel I/O port, a serial I/O port, and the standard PlayStation AV out that was used up until the PlayStation 3. These models are pretty difficult to find locally, so you'll have to resort to good old eBay for this one, most likely. The second iteration of the console removed the direct composite out ports, but left the other I/O intact. The third revision, however, removed the parallel I/O port, leaving only the standard AV out and the serial I/O port. I like to call this one the bare bones model. And around the year 2000, Sony also released a mini version of the PlayStation. No, not that one, but this one. This version was released in July 2000 and made it all the way to March of 2006. That means that the PS1 had an effective lifespan of 11 years, which is stupidly long for a console. This smaller unit obviously had a tiny footprint, making it very easy to take with you. Sony took advantage of this portability and gave people the option to add a display and speakers. That's right, you could actually play full console games on the go back then if you really wanted to. Eat your heart out, Switch. Accessories for the console were plentiful, including things like multi-taps, steering wheels, the infamous memory cards for storing your saves, light guns aplenty, cheat devices, and much, much more. And of course there were the games. Oh my lord, the games. There's too many amazing titles to really mention them all, but I can give you a few. You got Metal Gear Solid, you got Final Fantasy VII, you got Resident Evil 2, you got Gran Turismo, you got Symphony of the Night, Tomb Raider, and there's a whole lot more, so don't get too mad at me if I didn't include your favorite. There is a reason this console is as legendary as it is, and it's all about the games. And now that we have the console introduced, I think it's about time we start moving on to its history. Now it's time to meet the man himself, Ken Kutaragi, the man responsible for PlayStation. In fact, he's called the father of PlayStation, so you know he's legit. Kutaragi personally designed his magnum opus, using his passion for engineering and emerging technology to create one of the most influential consumer electronic devices ever released. Let's learn a little bit more about the man himself. Ken Kutaragi was born on August 2nd, 1950, in none other than Tokyo, Japan. He was born to business-owning parents who, at the time, owned a printing company. As Kutaragi progressed into childhood and adolescence, his parents allowed him to build his mechanical knowledge by performing work around the printing plant. Kutaragi, even as a youngster, was known as a very dedicated and hardworking individual, not only excelling at work, but at school as well. Kutaragi was known to be a very advanced student, earning straight A's in school. From a very early age, Kutaragi was quite interested in mechanics and electronics, what with his job at his parents' plant giving him plenty of knowledge. Kutaragi was also known to be quite the tinkerer, often taking apart his possessions as a child to figure out what made them tick. This curiosity would prove very beneficial to him as he would go on to learn about the deep intricacies of electronic circuitry and design. He would go on to attend classes at the University of Electrocommunications in Tokyo, where he earned an electronics degree. Right after finishing college, Kutaragi joined Sony in 1975 and started out as an engineer, helping to design products for Sony like some of the earliest LCD displays, digital cameras, and various other products. Kutaragi built a name for himself at Sony over the next 13 years, eventually being regarded as one of the company's most talented and hard-working engineers. Kutaragi would go on to head Sony's computer entertainment division and would eventually win a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2014 for his monumental contributions to the gaming industry. Kutaragi in the late 1980s was extremely fascinated with the capabilities of technologies like CD-ROM. This became very apparent to him when he would often watch his daughter play her original Famicom, noticing how lackluster the sound quality was. This experience would continue to resonate with him for years to come, and it was one of those moments that really pushed him to advocate for the use of better, more capable technologies like CDs, which would ultimately lead to the creation of the PlayStation. After busting his ass at Sony for those 13 years, Kutaragi hit quite a turning point in his career. The year was now 1988, and the gaming industry had just been pulled out of the rut 3 years earlier by none other than Nintendo. At this time, Sony was not particularly interested in entering the gaming market, but this all changed with the arrival of Nintendo at Sony's doorstep. Nintendo was very much aware of Sony's development and engineering prowess, as well as Kutaragi's, and were researching and trying to collect new technologies for their new upcoming platform, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo had already been dealing with Sony, in fact, who were supplying the sound chip that would go into the Super Nintendo. Ken Kutaragi actually spearheaded the relationship between Nintendo and Sony because of this. He actually designed the sound chip for the Super Nintendo behind his superior's back, even though they didn't approve of his project. Kutaragi was a massive advocate for Sony's new CD-based technologies, and according to former SCEA boss Shigeo Maruyama, would always tell executives at Nintendo that they should have a CD-based system that Kutaragi could help design and bring to market as a bit of a joint venture. In fact, Maruyama was an accomplice of Kutaragi, playing a huge role in the development of PlayStation. Maruyama recalls becoming completely engrossed in the idea of Kutaragi's new console, working alongside him very closely. Without Maruyama's assistance in settling arguments between top executives and Kutaragi himself, there is a very big chance that the entire PlayStation project could have been axed. Kutaragi very much touted the fact that CD-ROMs are far superior to ROM cartridges, since they could hold around 600 megabytes compared to the ROM chip's 4 megabytes at the time. He would continue to push for the use of Sony's new CD technology in a Nintendo system, particularly a bit of CD tech called CD-ROM/XA. This new technology brought things to the CD standard like the ability, and this is crucial here, to run compressed audio, video, and graphics data off the disc simultaneously. Previously, CD-ROM technology could only run one of these things at once, very much restricting what the format was capable of. This new tech made the CD-ROM format a viable medium for video game storage and distribution. Games could now have more advanced graphical and sound capabilities, and this new breakthrough development had Sony, and namely Kutaragi, wanting to push the new tech to market in a finished goods product. Kutaragi continued to hound Nintendo about building a CD-based platform for them, but the big N was pretty apprehensive at first. It was a new, unproven technology that could have required Nintendo to completely develop hardware from the ground up, and Nintendo didn't really want to move away from cartridges. They were stable, durable, and they loaded immediately. One of Nintendo's biggest concerns regarding the CD-ROM technology actually was that users would not want to wait for their games to load, which is something that, as we all know with cartridges, you didn't really have to do. Nintendo was definitely looking for new tech, but it took some time for them to warm up to CDs. But alas, Kutaragi kept going on to Nintendo about Sony's new amazing CD technology, and after a lot of convincing, Nintendo finally broke and agreed to allow Sony and Kutaragi to develop a CD-ROM/XA based add-on for the Super Nintendo. Not a full console, but at least an add-on. This would allow Nintendo to spend minimal amounts of money actually developing the hardware themselves, and would let them see just how this new technology would perform in the real world. Of course, this didn't actually happen, but it seemed to be the initial intention. In June of 1991, Sony wanted to make the agreement with Nintendo official, specifically to the public, and at that year's CES in Chicago, they announced the partnership between Nintendo and Sony to create and market a new hybrid console called the Super Disc. This was great news to most people. It meant that two of the biggest entertainment companies out there were banding together to bring gaming in an entirely new direction. But, of course, Murphy's Law was in full effect regarding what would become a cursed partnership, if you can even call it that at this point. Seemingly out of nowhere, and only one whole day after Sony's announcement of the deal, Nintendo decided they would go and partner with Philips instead, right in front of Sony. They did so by publicly announcing that they had partnered with Philips, Sony's direct competitor, and there is a lot of speculation as to why Nintendo did this, but official industry sources back in 1991 attribute the breakdown to unfair terms on Sony's end of the deal, and that Sony asserted that it should have the rights to collect all revenue from the sale of disc-based software on this new hybrid system. This included software developed by Nintendo. I don't think Nintendo liked that very much, and they ultimately decided to screw right off over to Philips, Sony's direct competitor, when subjected to these terms. But in the end, Nintendo did originally agree to these terms, so they were in fact in the wrong to do this. Howard C. Lincoln, senior vice president of Nintendo of America at the time, claimed while speaking to New York Times during this whole mess that the problem with the Sony deal was that from a technological standpoint, Philips also had superior hardware. Whether or not this statement was a cover-up for the aforementioned issue is up to debate. This is plausible, however, considering that Philips at the time was creating tech just as advanced as Sony, and they were a much bigger player back then than they are these days. Naturally, Sony was a little furious, to say the least. Nintendo had just screwed them out of a good deal, at least for Sony, that could have made them a fair bit of cash. Not only that, but Nintendo had betrayed Sony outright. This is a gargantuan no-no, especially in Japanese business culture. Not only did it step all over the valued partnership between the two companies, but Nintendo partnered with a foreign company in doing so. Most people saw this decision as completely outrageous, especially in Japan. Kutaragi wanted to continue on with his beloved project, but by this point, Sony, or more precisely the top brass at Sony, were a little burnt out on this whole CD console thing, and they really wanted to pull the plug on it. But that wasn't stopping Kutaragi. So, what did he do? Well, Kutaragi is a stubborn man, of course in a good way, and managed to convince his superiors to allow him to develop his console. After a lot of pushing, Kutaragi and his team at Sony continued to develop a new console from the ground up, using most of the technology that they had developed for Nintendo. Might as well use it, right? So, with Sony free to use their new tech in a console, they got to work. After all the interesting events of 1991 leading up until this point, Nintendo and Sony did eventually decide to continue on together, although in greatly reduced fashion. It was agreed between the two parties that Nintendo would allow Sony to release games on any future SNES CD console. This was proposed since both companies had invested massive amounts of time and money by this point. This little agreement didn't last long, however, and it had become clear by this point that neither company had anything to gain by staying in the false pretense of an alliance. They eventually completely broke off from one another, never speaking of the incident officially ever again. By the time 1992 rolled around, Sony was a hair away from completely pulling out of the gaming industry and shutting Kutaragi's entire operation down with the flip of a switch. However, Kutaragi is... well, he's Kutaragi. He was not going to let this beloved project go under, no matter what. During a meeting with Sony president Norio Oga, Kutaragi desperately tried to save his console. During this meeting, Kutaragi would make incredibly bold claims about the kind of hardware he was trying to push. Not only this, but he also played with Oga's emotions and Japanese ethic, stating to him that Nintendo had betrayed their business and that it would be unhonorable to simply walk away as opposed to fighting back against their aggressor. Nintendo had, after all, abused Sony's trust, not to mention doing so while Sony was already supplying them with parts for their existing consoles to begin with. Kutaragi said to Oga that this could be a massive moment of pride for Sony. They could rise from the ashes with a console far ahead of its time, and they could do it in extravagant fashion. Kutaragi was to create a console heretofore unmatched in power, and it seemed like Oga was all ears. Kutaragi's speech really struck a nerve with his boss, and later in 1994, Sony finally confirmed that they were in the process of developing a full-fledged, revolutionary game console, then dubbed the PlayStation X. Sony decided to name it this to set it apart from its failed past iteration, and early reports of the console touted very impressive hardware unlike anything seen in a console before it. Many developers were claiming both this, and that this new console would truly be the next big thing to hit the scene. One very smart thing on Sony's part with the PS1 was deciding to create strictly a video game console. It was to be a video game machine designed to play video games. Even with all the mistakes they made with Nintendo, Sony was paying attention when the 3DO and the CDI failed. They realized, at least in that day and age, you needed a good platform that wasn't confused as to what it wanted to be. This was not going to be a multimedia powerhouse unit. This was a mature, refined gaming console for mature, refined gamers. The console was reportedly so powerful for the time that when Sega boss Hayao Nakayama read potential specifications, he was actually angered by his own project's lack of power, and he marched right on over to his console development team and demanded that they beef up their current console in development, the Sega Saturn. The response to this was simply to add another CPU. Yeah, that didn't work out too well, guys, now did it? As I covered in my two past console overviews, all this really did was hike up the price of the Saturn and make it harder to develop for. There was very little benefit to this near last-minute hardware edition, and long story short, the Saturn failed in just about everywhere but Japan. Another thing that helped Sony dominate the generation is that Sony had already been established as a quality consumer and professional electronics brand. Their products were, and still are to an extent, regarded as some of the best in the industry. It's not hard to believe that the PS1 was going to be successful. It was a quality Sony product, it appealed to a demographic that was beginning to blow up, and it was made to do one thing. And that was play games. Now, not everyone in Sony supported the idea of this new console. Many individuals within the company simply stated that video games are a child's toy, as were the consoles that played them. Kutaragi's team was very much aware of this, striving to change the attitude that game consoles were simply toys. Kutaragi and his team made the final design of the console look sleek and serious, lacking overly bright colors and odd shapes. It was a solid, rectangular gray brick that somehow seemed to ooze sophistication in its blandness. Even with all of Kudaragi's effort, as always, there were still some naysayers within the gaming community. Many people pointed out Sony's short-lived and turbulent track record in the industry, stating that the company was too inexperienced to have a successful console on their hands. Sony also hadn't released any good games to prove that they were decent at developing first-party titles. All they had were the poorly performing and poorly reviewed ImageSoft FMV games that they had released for consoles like the Sega CD, and yes, that did actually happen. Software was the one area where Sony was very much lacking. Creating the best hardware had always been their thing. Software, on the other hand, well, they weren't really known for that. Especially not video game software. Sony did try to circumvent this issue by buying developers like Psygnosis, who would develop crucial launch titles like Wipeout and Destruction Derby. But even with these titles in development for their console, it was still thought that Sony would fall behind because of their lack of software prowess. So in response, what did Sony do? Well, they hit up Namco. Namco knew just about everything there was to know about game software, and they had been in the industry for years, fiercely fighting against rivals like Sega in the arcade space. Sony noticed Namco's massive success with games like Pac-Man and Ridge Racer, and they wanted in on some of that action. And I think it's pretty safe to say that when Sony announced that PlayStation would be getting releases like Ridge Racer on their console, things turned around pretty quick. This announcement alone caused a huge stir in the gaming industry. Everyone was both blown away and skeptical that a home game console could run a very graphically demanding arcade title like Ridge Racer. Remember that back then, arcades were still, for many, the ultimate gaming experience. Many consoles of the 80s and 90s tried to emulate the experience of an arcade, and Sony was about to try and bridge that gap. Now, while the game wasn't arcade perfect, it was still massively impressive considering the hardware it was running on. Other titles like Jumping Flash and Battle Arena Toshinden also had screenshots released to the public, and the public absolutely was stunned by the raw capabilities of the PSX. It was clear by this point that Sony had superior hardware that would absolutely crush the competition. With all the hype building in the Japanese market throughout the rest of 1994, Sony finally dropped the console in Japan on the aforementioned date of December 3rd. Little had they known that they had just changed gaming history forever. The console released in Japan with pretty strong numbers, although at the beginning the PS1 was being outpaced by the Saturn. As I've mentioned before, the Saturn was actually quite successful in Japan, although the PS1 did eventually surpass it in sales quite heavily. Sega had a few days head start and had already sold a few 100,000 units. The Saturn's Japanese launch was very strong actually, in fact it was record-setting. The biggest reason for this being a game called Virtua Fighter. At the time, the arcade fighting game was stupidly popular in Japan, and having a game like this on a console that you could play at home was not something that many Japanese gamers could easily go without. Starting out, the two consoles sold pretty evenly in Japan, but Sony turned it around in the coming months with huge releases from developers like Namco, Konami, and Capcom. Sony kept releasing hit after hit, while Sega stagnated on first-party game development. Sony used their third-party developers as a weapon against Sega, making their platform extremely accessible when compared to the foreign architecture of their competitor. Many consumers also quickly noted the visual superiority of the PlayStation. Sony's machine could support texture transparency and advanced lighting effects, which are a couple of things that Sega's console lacked outright. These two things made a big difference in games back then, and with the price tag of the PS1 being less than Sega's console, it was no surprise that Sony ended up overtaking Sega in Japan, even with the Saturn's general success in the region. Sony had taken over Japan with their new hardware, and now it was time for the Western market to experience Sony's magnum opus for themselves. Now it's time for E3 1995. This E3 went down in history as not only being the first, but also one of the most important in the entire history of the event. The events at this E3 would completely change the balance of the gaming industry going forward, and would solidify not only E3's place in the industry, but also Sony's. The effects of this E3 linger to this very day. A day before the event, many companies in the industry held pre-event press conferences, including companies like Sega, who were about to get well, annihilated by Sony the next day. These press conferences were pretty subdued compared to the events of the actual event. These two companies would later be bitter enemies, especially after the release of their respective consoles. We're going to pay extra attention to Sony and Sega today since the competition at E3 95 was fierce between these two companies. Sega had a console that was confused in its design and clearly rushed out to patch up the disasters that were the Sega CD and 32X, while Sony had a revolutionary new console that was simple, comparatively inexpensive, and easy to develop for. This was in stark contrast to Sega's Saturn. In North America, the Saturn hadn't been released yet, and Sega kicked off E3 announcing that the Saturn was available in stores for the price of $399 at this very moment. No, seriously. If you wanted to leave E3 and go to, say, Babbage's to get a Saturn, you actually could right then and there. This move was clearly to do what Sega had done in Japan, getting a head start to solidify sales before the launch of their competitor. So, how did Sony respond? Well, they responded like this.
$299.
The funny part about this announcement is that Sony actually stole Steve Race, an executive from Sega, and they brought him onto their company, so he got to actually announce their competitor's console, which is absolutely hilarious. Sony used the event to show that they were 120% serious about being a true player in the gaming industry. They expressed that they were well versed in the technology and the entertainment realm, and that they were committed to making their console a success. They took the time to display all the third-party support that they had gathered for their platform. And of course, they dropped the release date of Saturday, September 9th, 1995. And launch it did. It launched like a goddamn smasher with 900% damage. Now, while the console was a little pricey at
$299,
it was still $100 cheaper than its competitor, which of course was the Saturn. The console launched in North America to around 100,000 pre-orders, and stores around the region were reporting that it was extremely difficult to keep the consoles on shelves, seeing as how it was massively popular. Stores were selling out of peripherals and games as well. The system launched with 17 titles, although there was no pack-in title as with the Japanese launch. The marketing campaign in North America was a little different from consoles past in that it targeted an older age demographic, usually trying to appeal to those aged over 16 years old. This was evidenced by their You Are Not E advertising campaign, with the E referring to age ratings. Sony Computer Entertainment of America reportedly had an advertising budget of $40 million, and they definitely used it. The US launch was very successful for Sony, and although I can't find solid numbers for the launch period, I'm going to estimate that an upwards of 600,000 to 800,000 units had been sold in the months following the console's release. By the end of 1996, just under 2 million units had been sold in the United States alone. This was definitely helped by a price cut to $199, which made the console even more attractive to American gamers than it already was. Most people in America and worldwide looked at the PlayStation as the definitive next-generation experience, with many gamers choosing to switch purely to Sony since the experience was just that much better on their platform. Even the younger age demographics that Sony wasn't even targeting were starting to shift to Sony, which quickly accrued them plenty of American and worldwide market share. Many people who were waiting patiently for the N64 to come out decided to ultimately jump ship on Nintendo and buy into Sony's platform, as many gamers were beginning to become impatient with Nintendo. All Nintendo really showed at E3 1995, after all, was the underwhelming Virtual Boy. Many people were skeptical of Nintendo and were quick to notice the massive step up from the Super Nintendo to the PlayStation. By Christmas of 1996, there were over 200 games available for the PS1 and apparently over 400 in development, making it very easy for anyone to jump into the console and find something that fit their playstyle and tastes. It's definitely not hard to believe that the PS1 was an absolute smash hit worldwide. Sony was extremely open and inviting for third-party developers, and it seemed like Sony's own lack of software prowess was actually somewhat of a blessing in disguise, as it forced them to have this open mentality with their software partners. This attracted a ton of developers and greatly contributed to the PS1's gigantic library. Nintendo and Sega mostly relied on their first-party titles to sell their consoles. That was their primary business model. And I know you're going to say, but Nintendo and Sega had tons of awesome third-party games! And yes, they did, but the business model for those two companies was primarily the sale of first-party hardware and software. For the most part, this is still where Nintendo makes most of their money today, for better or worse. Third party is somewhat of an afterthought, as unfortunate as that is sometimes. Sony clearly didn't take this approach, and good lord did it pay off. As mentioned before, Sony had somewhere around 400 games being developed for their platform compared to 200 for Sega and 60 for Nintendo 64. In 1996, Sony had to expand their CD production, building CD manufacturing facilities in Springfield, Oregon. This was due to shortages of discs stemming from just how popular this console was. It was absolutely blowing up, and unlike the Saturn, it was blowing up everywhere, not just in Japan. And naturally, Sony was quick to surpass Sega quite heavily, as mentioned before. Eventually, it wasn't even a contest anymore. The Saturn basically ceased to exist in most Western markets. This includes Europe and Oceania, if you want to call Oceania Western. In fact, there's reports of many gamers thinking that Sega simply stopped making consoles after the Genesis. That's how bad the console was doing in the West. It basically didn't exist. Although Sega would make somewhat of a comeback with the Dreamcast in 1999, which I talk about extensively in my first console overview, which I highly recommend you check out if you like this video. So it was official. The PlayStation was a proper worldwide success, and Ken Kutaragi had finally achieved his dream of building a machine with more advanced hardware than anything else, and he gave it mass appeal. In doing so, he created one of the most important electronic devices ever released. Love it or not, it's thanks to the PlayStation that games are as big and bold as they are today. It really did advance and revitalize the industry during a time where there was a lot of stagnation, and brought gamers unbelievable experiences that would carry them on to Sony's many successor consoles. Sony introduced a period of fierce competition, the likes of which still continues today. This competition within the industry continued to drive game hardware and software forward into the 21st century, eventually leading to the massive, deep, and sprawling games that we have today. Sony also managed to dethrone Nintendo as the ultimate gaming industry master, which really was a feat in of itself. Nintendo, and to a lesser extent Sega, had quite a stranglehold on the video game market. Sony managed to undo a lot of this and really cement themselves in the gaming industry, accruing and matching Nintendo's 40% market share by 1997. And just for fun, Sega held a measly 12% market share by the end of 1998, and they had completely given up on the Saturn by that point. Now, you could definitely blame this situation on Nintendo's poor decisions with the N64, what with their lack of haste in getting the console released, and their unfortunate choice to use cartridges. And surprise, the N64 will be our next console overview, as well as the first one on a Nintendo console, so stay tuned for that. The PS1 is actually a very special console for me, as it was the first console that I ever properly owned. I had played plenty of consoles before it, but the PS1 was my very own home gaming machine, and I loved the hell out of it. I remember spending so many hours playing Tomb Raider and Spyro, and I will never forget the experiences that this console gave me as a kid. The PlayStation, along with the Game Boy, really made me into the gamer that I am today, and my life would be far more boring if they weren't around. The PS1 truly was an innovative, revolutionary machine that completely flipped the gaming industry upside down, and while there are a lot of criticisms about the negative impacts of a non-gaming company entering the gaming market, I really do think that Kutaragi's efforts to release this console really paid off. The determination of one stubborn engineer completely changed all of our lives and introduced many of us to the incredible world of 3D gaming. So here's to you, Kutaragi. You may have made some pretty substantial mistakes over the years, but it's thanks to you that we have the gaming industry that we do today, for better or worse. And to be honest, I think it's for the better. Kutaragi and his team changed the lives of so many people, and it all stemmed from that one fateful day that Nintendo dared betray him. Thank you, Kutaragi, and thank you, PlayStation, for all the experiences that you've brought me and millions of other gamers. The story of the PlayStation is a story of betrayal, extreme determination, and ultimately massive success and technological advancement. If you haven't picked one up yet, I very highly recommend you do so and experience this incredible console for yourself, because if you haven't, you're really missing out, and I very highly doubt you'll regret your purchase. Thank you very much for joining me on this third console overview. I put massive amounts of time and effort into this video as well as money, so I really do hope you enjoyed it, and be sure to drop a like and subscribe so you can see the next one and all of our new stuff that comes out. Also, feel free to let me know if you'd like a part 2 and what you'd want to see in it, because I do actually want to get some ideas from you guys, and seeing as how active the comment section is on some of the older ones, I would really love to hear what some of you guys want to see, because I mean, if I can engage the audience, that would be awesome. So yeah, I do have a lot of new content planned for the coming months, so I actually am in the middle of somewhat of a rebranding for the channel. So there is new stuff coming, there is better stuff coming, so definitely stay tuned for that. I actually do have some stuff in the works already, some project files open, so you'll see them when they come out. I think you're gonna like them a lot. It's very much more in the style of a video like this, where it's better produced. It's not just me blabbing on a microphone for half an hour. It's well produced like this one. So yeah, I really hope you guys are looking forward to that, and I will see you in the next one.
And that's pretty much how it happened.